Hey everyone, John Frechette here, CEO of Mora, Moara.io. Topic for this week is this is the third part of a four-part series, AI across the research stack. Today we'll be covering full text reviews and evidence synthesis using AI. But I should mention there's also an element of this that's really just a tutorial, kind of a one-on-one on full text reviews and evidence synthesis. So here's where we are currently. Again, I mentioned this is part three of a four-part series. First thing I always cover is the fact that we like to think of literature reviews in terms of stages, one, two, three, four. The reality is it's more like a funnel, in my opinion. You start with search, and indeed search engines specifically are the first part to screen papers, in short. You go through some screening yourself, you go through full text review. The whole time going through the funnel, you're really trying to determine what papers are going to come out of the end of this process and end up in your own publication or grant proposal or whatever. And I should say, when you get to evidence synthesis, you're really even going a step further and saying not just what papers are going to end up in my own research, but also what specific data points or findings. That's what we'll start to cover today. Per usual, full text reviews and evidence synthesis is those are both massive topics. I sort of regret not putting them into one, honestly, so we'll try to cover everything I can as quickly as possible. I will say last session was, excuse me, screening. And most often what people are referring to when they say screening is title and abstract screening. Okay, we showed the interface where you literally have pretty straightforward title, abstract, then some include, exclude, unsure buttons that you can click, notes, tags, include reasons why you might be screening out a paper, etc. And so how do we go from screening to full text? So again, screening involves quick relevance decisions based on titles and abstracts. Let me just move my button here. Full text review involve much deeper engagement with entire papers, trying to, yes, determine eligibility. I might just describe it again as, does this paper meet our include, exclude criteria? Those could be very formally documented, or it could be kind of a heuristics base. In my mind, I have some things I'm looking for in a paper. And then full text also involves data extraction. So there's a screening component, and then there's a component to it that relates to actually, pulling certain elements out of papers and summarizing them, such as methodology and key findings and intervention methods, etc. There's one more not mentioned here that I'll get into, which is called, for systematic reviews, a risk of bias assessment. Similarly, even for narrative reviews, there's got to be some kind of even mental model to really figure out if an article is credible or not. Kind of summarizing, by the way, the key takeaways here up front. Less volume, more depth than the screening section. So typically 10 to 50% of title and abstract screen records get to full text. By the way, by contrast, I would say around 90% of the records that go into title and abstract screening get weeded out. And then once you get into full text screening here, it's 10 to 15%, it's 50%. So what am I saying? 50 to 90% get weeded out here. New cognitive demands, yes, reviewers, it's no longer kind of rifling through papers quickly. Screening, you might spend a minute on a paper. Here, obviously, we're talking about more like 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes. Reviewers assess methodology, extract data, evaluate what's called risk of bias. That's a very kind of formal area, again, of systematic reviews, but we can summarize it here. And then, in short, where AI can help most, automated data extraction, though there are concerns about making sure you're actually learning the contents of a paper. Indeed, cross-study comparisons, identifying inconsistencies, and we'll get a little bit into evidence synthesis as well. It's great to have slides here, but I try to show actual software products as well. And I try to show other tools. We run a company called, again, Mora is mother of all research assistants, Mora.io, but try to show others because other tools do what we can't do well, and we do what others can't do well in some cases. Rayyan is a systematic review software a lot of people use and love. I just took one example, screenshot from their site. Funny enough, it's a Rayyan paper, but it applies to any full text article here, and it's pretty clear. You can see you've got the full text. You have, I imagine, some kind of annotation methods, and then include, maybe exclude with reasons, and then tags, labels, and then you can add notes. Pretty straightforward, but that's what full text screening looks like. Again, I would say if you're splitting full text reviews into three elements, this is the first: full text screening, data extraction, risk of bias assessments. Full text data extraction, again, I'm just going to go through all of them. Right here is Covidence, another systematic review tool, probably the most, definitely not a newer tool. I bet it's the most popular though in terms of market share. And what I am showing here is a data extraction field in Covidence. So on one side of this, you've got your full text, PDF. On the other side, Covidence in particular involves a lot of manual data extraction. That's a good thing in some respects, a bad thing in others. It's not very efficient, but you learn a lot about the article, and they've got some good templates you can use. So, for example, here I can actually, let's say I'm, studying a paper that has multiple different models or model specifications. I created a table if I want to. So this person is actually creating this table. As you can imagine, when you get into regression models and regression tables, obviously you need to create those tables as well. So this is maybe a good way to extract, empirical results also. And then risk of bias assessment is kind of a whole different ball game. This is not a tool necessarily. This is from a particular LibGuide. But risk of bias, these are the types of dimensions you might look at. And indeed, these are embedded in some of the systematic review tools like the ones I just showed you. Not tremendously automated, not integral to the workflow like screening is, say, but I think it's good to get a handle on this. So testing out different kind of bias conditions. Bias arising from the randomization process due to deviations from intended interventions, missing outcome data, measurement of the outcome, selection of the reported result. Now, I would add a couple others. When I'm going through, you might call this technical risk of bias. You might call it something different, evaluating citations. I know I'm looking at things like the organizations behind the author names, conflicts of interest, etc., but different flavor here. So this is a really good one, and I do feel like, spoiler alert, we'll get into some ways in which a lot of this could really be automated, or at least, the first draft could be created using AI to do full text reviews. And those are the key kind of components, main issues with manual full text review. The most important one, of course, is time. Large reviews can take 6 to 18 months. Overall, systematic reviews, full text review is the largest chunk of this here. Evidence synthesis and writing is a lot as well. You might want to split up those two, I don't know. But full text reviews take a lot. And keep in mind, if we're screening out, let's call it 50% of our papers, then you're reading a lot of content from articles that ultimately are getting screened out for your study. Now, that might be a good thing because you get some context into the studies you don't include. That's great, but in some respects, you're reading through some, somewhat irrelevant papers. So a lot of cognitive load. As I mentioned, reviewers need to do these three things together: kind of evaluate methodology, extract data, assess bias. Growing publication volumes means reviews might be outdated by the time they're published. Yet again, that's the time issue. Best use cases in full text reviews, and to an extent, they sort of resemble the screening use cases, a little bit at least. The first one is checking papers against inclusion exclusion criteria. I had mentioned in screening, but certainly in full text as well. There's some really good, you would never want to fully delegate this activity to a model or you don't want to fully outsource it, but if you establish your inclusion exclusion criteria, I showed an example in the last one where you might be able to, for example, get an initial recommendations in terms of whether or not that criteria is met based on the full text review, and then a little bit of context involved. Then it should be really on human reviewers to click include, exclude, unsure. Second one, relatedly, is data extraction. Now, in the context of screening, I had mentioned you can do data extraction and that feeds into inclusion exclusion criteria. That's indeed true. But then in this case, we might be talking about even fields outside of that, right? If you have 20 different fields you're trying to gather, we just showed the Covidence example. The example I'll give again is you might have a table with a bunch of regression results. Pretty hard to copy, sort of weird to write down. You've got all sorts of asterisks that indicate statistical significance. Wouldn't it be really cool if, let's take a very simple example, screenshot the table, put it into Claude or some other tool, and then you could get a structured table in return, and you could still have those statistical significance indicators. I think it's a really interesting use case. And then finally, as I mentioned, yes, risk of bias assessments. having AI tools actually score studies on methodological quality domains, I might say, coming up with some qualitative insights again about the backgrounds of the studies, the motivations for the studies. I do think that's a good use case, assuming, yet again, humans are sort of making the final analysis and decisions and checks. So I think that's key. Now, one example that isn't mentioned here, you might call it AI, you might not, whatever it is. I just wanted to kind of quickly plug one feature within Mora, which is what we call the annotations feature. We've got kind of a toolbox of products, and one of them is annotations. Very, very simple stuff. You have all of your papers loaded up under your show list. You have, 50, 10, 100 papers loaded up. You can actually go through those, make annotations, and unlike a situation where, as it was for me in the past, I have 30 tabs open with all different PDFs and I highlight text and never come back to it because it's too hard to find. This has two features. Our product has two features that really make this a seamless process. One is when you highlight text and click kind of save snippet, that text automatically gets saved down as, into a database. So that's the number one thing, and I think that's really important. So you can actually literally copy and paste that snippet that you've highlighted into another sheet, and you'll get something that says Per Smith et al. 2024 and the quote. So it's a very usable thing. Now, if you make 50 annotations across 10 papers, all of that is in a database on our site. So you can actually go through, grab all of those, export them, whatever you'd like. That's the one piece. The second piece is more straightforward. Highlight this, you get the snippet, scroll through the document, and then if you want to find where that was, you can click this right side snippet and it'll jump you right back to that page. Two helpful, very straightforward ways to make annotations more interactive. And then maybe the last kind of focus item under the full text review is just to say there have been some studies. This one in particular did a big literature review of AI benefits and systematic reviews. I've got the in-text citation here. I'll make the link in the YouTube description. And what it found, a lot of these were studied screening. This one specifically found within data extraction, there's a time savings potential of 99.6%. Kind of crazy, but also not hard to imagine why. I mean, if everyone probably has gone through the use case of taking a PDF, importing it into ChatGPT or Claude, and then asking a question in return. If you just have your data extraction elements set up ahead of time, and you import 10 or 50 papers, and it goes through that process, yes, there's going to be some processing, but in terms of the work you do on it, you go get a coffee, whatever, all of that will then pump out. It'll be, ready to go for you. Having said that, this number is a bit misleading in my opinion because obviously, we can't just fully rely on the data extractions. And what's more, you still got to read through them, of course. So, nonetheless, though, huge, massive improvements, particularly when you get to larger and larger reviews. Evidence synthesis is the next topic to discuss here. Again, I almost wish they were separate presentations, but let me just say, evidence synthesis is an area of literature reviews that's very interesting to me. Prior to really jumping into the topic of systematic reviews, I hadn't thought much about formal methods and processes for evidence synthesis. And I do think it is described as an incredibly standardized, formalized area of literature reviews, but the reality is we are mostly referring to kind of high-level frameworks when we talk about evidence synthesis. Yes, if you go into, I don't know, Cochrane Central Guidelines, and I'm sure you can find all sorts of procedures, but everyone has a fairly different view on what an evidence synthesis output looks like. Let me just say three major categories, okay? Pretty obvious. Qualitative synthesis, that's, for example, finding themes in qualitative outputs and research. And so that might involve, for example, tagging directional findings, positive or negative effects, even if there's no statistical results. Quantitative synthesis is very different, much more rigorous, generally involving some, let's call it, empirical, or I should say statistical methods. And that is doing things like meta-analyses. What's a meta-analysis? In short, it's a way to take 10, 20, 50 studies that study the same research question and find interesting ways to average them, in short. And then mixed methods just combines the two. Pretty straightforward. Again, there's quite a bit of variability in terms of how people view evidence synthesis and what output should look like. Unlike, say, a Prisma diagram or something like that, um, I would say there's quite a bit of differences in outputs. This is a great one I pulled actually from the NIH ODP YouTube channel, and then the actual URLs right here. But I think this is a very good example of what someone might consider to be an evidence synthesis type output. Here you could see this is broken up by kind of the scope of the studies. So center-based early childhood education versus full-day kindergarten programs. Really interesting. So let's call these segments of studies. You've got the N here, the frequency of those studies, and then it is the overarching conclusion. Again, let's call them directional findings. In most empirical question, it might be positive or negative effects. In this case, it's recommended strong, insufficient evidence, recommended sufficient, etc. This is a really great example of an evidence synthesis output. Now, again, this is science, and I think there's some art as well. That's when you get into actually writing down the narratives and doing a discussion analysis, but this is a very good first step. And I do think when you look at that output, just like data extraction, you could see how this could be automated fairly well. Do we want it automated is the question. And I think in terms of just kind of hard cataloging of papers, maybe that should be something that we use some of the models for. But then when it comes to actually interpreting them and again, coming up with some analysis, obviously that's maybe something we want to do ourselves. AI for evidence synthesis examples. Within qualitative, you've got things like tagging, automatic tagging. That's what I'll call thematic coding. You've got framework mapping, i.e. identifying theoretical frameworks. I think an example here would be, the implementation research framework is the first one. The point is you're identifying frameworks and then you're actually putting these papers and studies into those models. And then narrative drafting is when you can actually, and I think this is how most evidence synthesis happens in narrative reviews, is that you synthesize findings just by starting to write, conclusions in your literature review section of your paper, then you stamp citations onto it. That's the evidence synthesis. Importantly, we want to edit that for accuracy. And this is you could do this without writing from scratch. I would argue for a subtle approach that involves, for example, writing out the key theme yourself and then maybe using some tools to stack citations onto that and, compare studies and whatnot. Quantitative is very different. Effect size extraction, this is actually pulling those empirical results from papers, automated meta-analyses. Every single paper uses a different set of, for the most part, different set of control variables, different set of modeling specifications, different data sets. Reconciling two empirical results from one, across two papers is a very difficult thing to do. My own personal view is that this is one of the more powerful use cases here. I come from an economics background. If you read through, say, 10 studies that study the effect of, say, minimum wage increases on employment levels, you find such an enormous variety of results, very wide distribution. And so I do think there's a lot of intelligence. There are some good meta-analyses we can do, and then there's a lot of intelligence wrapped up in those differences in results across models. And so I do think that's a very good use case here. We can infer a lot by having an automated way to compare studies and reconcile them. And then sensitivity and subgroup, that is simply identifying outlier data sets or studies and then figuring out whether or not there might be stronger statistically significant estimates or meta-analysis averages or whatever if we segment studies. Pretty straightforward. A couple more slides here. Here is, once again, in our product, what evidence synthesis looks like. It is not quite as kind of mechanical and table, quantitative as the other one we saw, but all we've got is you have top methodologies, 5 bullet points, top findings, 5 bullet points, top gaps in the literature. That one's a little bit different. But I mean, methodology is a nice example. Again, all you're doing is figuring out where there is kind of a mode. Do you have 2 or 3 studies using the same methodology? That's somewhat of an example of at least starting the evidence synthesis process. And then the last kind of major slide here, limitations and best practices to keep in mind. Some of these, I hope most of these are not a surprise to anyone. But first, let me say this. Watch out for hallucinated data extractions. And by the way, by extension, hallucinated include exclude criteria mapping. Okay, LLMs might make stuff up, especially if you're not, really confident in the models you're using. You really need to do a check on at least the most substantial data extraction elements you're using in your paper and in your review. Poor handling of tables, figures, and supplementary materials, I think, is accurate. We find, for instance, in our product, it's a little bit hard to get the outputs looking very good when we use LLMs to produce evidence synthesis outputs. Inconsistent performance across domains and study designs. And then you've got the black box risk, i.e., if you're not doing this appropriately, reproducibility is really difficult. Whereas reproducibility in systematic reviews, especially if you're doing it manually, very, very easy to kind of explain your approach and document it and whatnot. Best practices, keep humans in the loop. This is my macro view on this space in general. I make the analogy often of software development. We've seen, adoption, AI adoption and software development really take off. And it started with, okay, write me a whole piece of software. And now it's iterate. Okay, change this, change that. Okay, plugging in different particular human generated insights throughout, back and forth, back and forth. That's how I think this space will play out as well. Use structured prompts with explicit schemas for data extraction. I would describe that simply by saying, get as much context as possible. Don't skimp on the context that you give to these models. Report AI involvement transparently per formal guidelines. In particular, again, Prisma type, Cochrane Central type guidelines, systematic reviews, and then journals, right? Each publisher is going to have different guidelines. And then finally, benchmark AI performance on a calibration set before scaling. A lot of companies should be able to offer up some insights about the accuracy of their models. So, very good things to keep in mind. And very last thing I'll just say to close out is a lot of these capabilities are included in Mora, Moara.io. A lot of them aren't. My advice always to researchers, especially students, is just try out a ton of tools, okay? If you see a tool that looks interesting, don't hesitate. Just click try for free. Maybe you try 10 tools that really stink. That 11th one's going to be awesome. So try out tools. Try out our tool if you're open to it. And if you find this useful, we're just getting our YouTube page going. Please subscribe. Really appreciate it. Please let me know any questions. Hope everyone's having a great week. Thanks.